Picture this. You're a merchant's daughter in London in the year 1348. The morning sun filters through the oiled parchment that serves as your window, and you wake to the familiar sounds of the city. Church bells, the cries of street vendors, the clatter of wooden cartwheels on cobblestone. You stretch in your bed, the straw mattress rustling beneath you, and reach for the chamber pot under your bed. It's overflowing again. Your father will empty it later, along with everyone else's, by simply opening the upstairs window and tossing the contents into the street below with a shouted warning of "Gardez l'eau." Watch out for the water. Except it's not water. You dress in the same woolen kirtle you've worn for 3 weeks straight. The fabric is stiff with sweat and grime, but you don't notice anymore. Nobody does. You run your fingers through your hair, dislodging a few lice, which drop onto your shoulders. You'll check your sister's hair for them later. It's become a daily ritual, almost comforting in its normalcy. Downstairs, your mother is preparing breakfast near the open sewer that runs directly past your door. The smell doesn't bother you. It's just London. It's just life. And what the people of medieval Europe considered normal hygiene represents one of the most disturbing disconnects between human health and daily practice in recorded history. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand medieval hygiene, or rather the shocking absence of it, you must first understand that these weren't ignorant people living in darkness. They were humans like us, with the same capacity for love, ambition, and innovation. The Romans before them had built sophisticated aqueducts, public baths, and sewage systems, hot running water, public latrines with actual plumbing, soap. The Romans understood cleanliness in ways that would put many medieval Europeans to shame. But when the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 AD, much of that knowledge collapsed with it. What replaced Roman infrastructure wasn't merely simpler, it was catastrophically inadequate. Medieval cities grew rapidly without any coherent plan for waste management, water supply, or disease prevention. By the 13th century, London had a population of nearly 80,000 people, all producing waste, all needing water, all living in conditions that would horrify modern sensibilities. Paris was even worse. Constantinople, still clinging to its Roman heritage, maintained some semblance of sanitation. But in Western Europe, the systems that had kept cities livable simply vanished. The medieval mindset around cleanliness was fundamentally different from ours. Bathing wasn't seen as a daily necessity for health. In fact, many physicians actively discouraged frequent bathing. Medical theory of the time, based on the ancient humoral system inherited from Galen and Hippocrates, held that opening the pores through hot water could allow bad air, or miasma, to enter the body and cause disease. Cold water was thought to shock the system. Water itself was viewed with deep suspicion. One medieval health manual warned that bathing fills the head with vapors. Another claimed that water penetrates the body and weakens the organism. This wasn't universal ignorance speaking. It was a systematic medical belief that washing your body could literally kill you. Religious attitudes reinforced this fear. The Catholic Church, which dominated medieval European life, sent deeply conflicting messages about cleanliness. On one hand, cleanliness was associated with godliness. Churches were kept clean. Priests washed their hands during Mass. On the other hand, excessive attention to the body was seen as vanity, a deadly sin. St. Francis of Assisi called his body "brother ass," and reportedly wore the same robe until it rotted off him, considering the lice that infested it a test of humility. St. Agnes supposedly never bathed in her entire life, viewing her bodily filth as a sign of devotion to spiritual rather than earthly concerns. For monks and nuns, dirt became a badge of holiness. St. Benedict's rule, which governed monastic life across Europe, permitted baths only for the sick. Healthy monks were expected to endure their grime. Saint Jerome praised a monk who was dirty and repulsive as a model of piety. When other monks complained about one particularly aromatic brother, they were told his stench was the sweet smell of sanctity. The logic was twisted but powerful. If you cared too much about your body, you cared too little about your soul. The system was designed to keep people dirty, and dirty they were, in ways that would transform minor inconveniences into death sentences. Let's start with the most basic human need: dealing with waste. In a medieval city, there were no sewers as we understand them, no underground pipes carrying waste away to treatment plants. Instead, most homes had chamber pots, simple ceramic or wooden bowls kept under beds or in corners. When these filled up, the contents had to go somewhere. That somewhere was usually the street. In London, Paris, Edinburgh, and virtually every medieval city, residents would simply open their windows and empty their chamber pots onto the street below. The polite ones shouted a warning first. The French cried, "Gardez-l'eau," which English speakers corrupted into "Gardez-l'eau." The warning gave pedestrians perhaps 2 seconds to press themselves against the nearest wall before a cascade of urine, feces, and sometimes menstrual rags came pouring down from above. City ordinances tried to regulate this practice. A 1189 London law required that residents wait until after dark to empty their pots. A 1372 Paris statute demanded that waste be dumped at specific locations, rather than just anywhere. These laws were routinely ignored. They were also completely unenforceable. What were city officials supposed to do? Station guards on every street to monitor nighttime dumping. The streets became rivers of filth. Rain would wash some of it away, creating sudden torrents of sewage that could knock people off their feet. Dry weather was worse. The waste would dry into a thick, caked layer that powdered into dust with every footstep and cartwheel. You breathed it. It coated your clothes. It stuck to the bottom of your shoes, and you tracked it into your home, where it mixed with the rushes and herbs scattered on your floor. These floor coverings were meant to absorb moisture and add pleasant scents, but they became repositories of every imaginable filth. Food scraps, spilled ale, pet waste, human waste, vomit, and the decomposing bodies of rats and insects. According to Erasmus of Rotterdam, who visited England in 1524, these floor rushes were occasionally renewed, but so imperfectly that the bottom layer is left undisturbed, sometimes for 20 years, harboring expectoration, vomiting, the leakage of dogs and men, ale droppings, scraps of fish, and other abominations not fit to be mentioned. When you walked across a medieval floor, you were walking through years of accumulated human and animal waste, compressed into a toxic, bacteria-laden mulch. But it was what happened in date that would haunt physicians for centuries to come. The waste in the streets wasn't just disgusting, it was a breeding ground for disease. Rats thrived in it, flies bred in it, and when the Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347, carried by fleas on those rats, the medieval sanitation system, or lack thereof, became a perfect delivery mechanism for the most devastating pandemic in human history. What you're about to hear represents one of the clearest examples of how hygiene practices can determine whether a civilization lives or dies. The plague entered Europe through trading ships arriving in Sicily from the east. Within months, it had spread across the continent. Within 3 years, it had killed between 75 and 200 million people, reducing Europe's population by 30 to 60%. Entire villages were wiped out. Cities became charnel houses. The death toll was so staggering that bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Medieval physicians had no understanding of germ theory. They didn't know about bacteria or viruses. They certainly didn't understand that the plague was spread by fleas living on rats, and that those rats were thriving in the filth that choked every medieval city. Instead, doctors blamed bad air, or miasma, the supposed poisonous vapors rising from rotting matter. Their solution was to avoid bad smells by carrying flowers or pomanders stuffed with herbs and spices. The famous plague doctor costume with its bird-like mask, was designed to filter bad air through aromatic substances packed into the beak. It did absolutely nothing to prevent infection. Because they didn't understand the real cause, medieval people responded to the plague in ways that often made things worse. They killed cats, believing them to be agents of the devil. This eliminated one of the few natural predators keeping rat populations in check. Rat populations exploded. The plague spread faster. In some cities, authorities ordered the streets to be cleaned, but this meant simply shoveling the waste into rivers, contaminating water supplies downstream. People avoided bathing, fearing that open pores would let plague vapors enter their bodies. They stayed in their filthy homes, breathing recycled air thick with the dust of decomposing floor rushes. The psychological impact was catastrophic. Parents watched their children develop the characteristic buboes, swellings in the lymph nodes that turned black and burst, leaking pus and blood. The smell was unbearable. The pain was excruciating, and there was nothing anyone could do. Physicians recommended bloodletting, which weakened patients further. They prescribed herbal remedies that had no effect. They suggested prayer. None of it worked. The plague killed indiscriminately, young and old, rich and poor, pious and sinful alike. One Italian chronicler wrote, "The victims ate lunch with their friends and dinner with their ancestors in paradise." A French physician noted, "In many houses, entire families perished, and bodies remained in beds for days until the stench alerted neighbors." In Florence, Giovanni Boccaccio observed mass graves so full that bodies had to be layered with dirt like lasagna. "The living scarcely seemed to care about the dead," he wrote, "and the dead were treated with no more respect than dead goats." This was only the beginning. Between plague outbreaks, medieval Europeans lived with a constant burden of parasites and infections that ranged from annoying to deadly. Lice were so common that delousing became a social activity. Mothers checked their children's hair daily. Friends helped each other pick out the insects, which were then crushed between thumbnails with a satisfying pop. The wealthy hired servants specifically for this purpose. A lousing room was a standard feature in aristocratic homes. Even royalty dealt with lice. When King Louis XIV of France's wig was removed, witnesses reported seeing a veritable colony of insects fleeing from his royal scalp. But lice weren't just irritating. They carried typhus, a disease that killed millions across Europe. Typhus thrives in conditions of overcrowding, poor sanitation, and unwashed clothing. Medieval cities provided all three. Outbreaks were called jail fever or camp fever because they devastated prisoners and soldiers who lived in especially filthy conditions. Symptoms included high fever, severe headache, and a distinctive rash that spread across the body. Delirium followed, then death, often within 2 weeks of infection. Fleas were equally ubiquitous. They infested the straw mattresses people slept on. They nested in clothing. They bred in the rushes on the floor. Medieval people accepted flea bites as a normal part of existence. There was even a prayer women supposedly recited before bed. "Good Lord, protect me from fire and water, and from fleas that bite me in the night." Some nobles kept small dogs specifically to attract fleas away from themselves. The logic was that fleas would prefer the dog's warmth, leaving the human relatively unbothered. It rarely worked. Bedbugs were another nightly torment. Medieval beds, with their heavy curtains and layers of fabric, provided perfect hiding places. The insects would emerge at night to feed, leaving itchy welts all over the body. There was no effective way to eliminate them, short of burning all your bedding and furniture, which most people couldn't afford to replace. So they lived with the bites, the itching, the knowledge that every night they'd be fed upon by hundreds of tiny parasites. Worms were perhaps worse. Intestinal parasites were so common that they were considered a normal part of having a digestive system. Tapeworms could grow to enormous lengths inside a person's intestines, stealing nutrients and causing chronic malnutrition. Roundworms caused abdominal pain and could sometimes be seen moving under the skin, a sight that drove some sufferers to madness. Pinworms caused intense itching around the anus, especially at night. Medieval remedies for worms ranged from ineffective to dangerous: swallowing garlic, drinking bitter herbs, or in extreme cases, ingesting mercury compounds that poisoned the patient as often as the parasites. What modern parasitologists would recognize as completely preventable infections became chronic conditions that sapped the strength and health of entire populations. The water supply was another catastrophic problem. Medieval cities drew their water from rivers, wells, and occasionally aqueducts left over from Roman times. The same rivers that provided drinking water also served as open sewers. Tanneries dumped toxic chemicals upstream. Butchers threw animal waste into the water. Dead animals decomposed in it. And of course, every household waste disposal led eventually to the river. In London, the Fleet River, which once ran clear enough that salmon spawned in it, became so polluted by the 13th century that it was described as a stream of sewage. The Thames was little better. Paris drew its water from the Seine, which received waste from thousands of households, workshops, and industries. Venice, surrounded by salt water, relied on wells, but these were often contaminated by seepage from cesspits. Medieval people knew the water tasted bad. They could see that it was murky and sometimes smelled foul. Their solution was not to clean the water or find a better source. Their solution was to avoid drinking water whenever possible. Instead, they drank ale, wine, or small beer, a weak alcoholic beverage that was safer than water because the brewing process involved boiling, which killed bacteria. Children drank ale. Monks drank beer. Even morning meals typically included some form of alcohol because water was considered dangerous to drink. They were right to avoid the water, but for the wrong reasons. They believed bad-tasting water indicated bad humors or demonic influence. They had no concept of bacteria, cholera, dysentery, or typhoid. When outbreaks of waterborne disease struck, killing hundreds or thousands, physicians blamed divine punishment or astrological alignments. The real cause, human waste contaminating drinking water, remained invisible to them. Can you imagine living in a world where every drink of water might kill you? Where the river running through your city is essentially an open sewer, yet it's also your only source of water for cooking, washing, and the occasional bath. This was everyday reality. Then came the day that would change everything. Or rather, the days, plural, because medieval Europeans faced not one, but multiple catastrophic health crises, all rooted in their hygiene practices. Between the 14th and 17th centuries, plague returned again and again. Each outbreak killed thousands. The 1665 Great Plague of London killed nearly a quarter of the city's population in just 7 months. The plague pit at Aldgate received so many bodies that mass graves had to be dug, each one containing hundreds of corpses stacked in layers. But plague wasn't the only killer. Typhus outbreaks ravaged armies and cities. Dysentery, caused by contaminated water and spread by flies breeding in human waste, killed thousands more. Smallpox disfigured and killed without regard to social class. Tuberculosis, thriving in damp, poorly ventilated homes, slowly destroyed lungs and left sufferers coughing up blood for months or years before death. The wealthy tried to protect themselves. They built houses with better ventilation. They employed servants to handle chamber pots. They could afford soap, which was expensive and heavily taxed in many regions. They sometimes bathed, though infrequently, in water heated by servants and perfumed with herbs. But even wealth couldn't fully protect you. Queen Elizabeth I of England supposedly bathed once a month, whether she needed it or not, a frequency considered remarkably hygienic for the time. Yet her court was constantly plagued by outbreaks of disease. Her own father, Henry VIII, suffered from chronic leg ulcers that stank so badly courtiers could smell him from rooms away. The poor had no defenses at all. They wore the same clothes until they fell apart. They never bathed, not because they chose not to, but because they had no access to clean water or any private space to bathe. They lived in overcrowded tenements where multiple families shared single rooms. They worked in trades that covered them in filth. Tanners stood in vats of urine used to treat leather. Dyers' hands were permanently stained with toxic chemicals. Butchers were covered in blood and fat. Waste collectors, called gong farmers, literally shoveled human excrement from cesspits, a job so revolting they were only permitted to work at night. A Venetian ambassador visiting London in 1497 wrote with barely concealed disgust, "There is no country in the world where there are so many thieves and robbers as in England, insomuch that few venture to go alone in the country, excepting in the middle of the day, and fewer still in the towns at night, and least of all in London. The houses are filthy, the streets are worse, and the stench is beyond belief." What makes this particularly disturbing is that it didn't have to be this way. The knowledge existed. The Romans had proven that cities could be clean, that water could be managed, that waste could be disposed of safely. But medieval society had collectively forgotten or rejected these practices, replacing them with a toxic combination of medical misinformation, religious attitudes that glorified suffering, and a complete absence of urban planning. The turning point came slowly, too slowly for the millions who died in the meantime. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical learning, including Roman sanitation practices. The scientific revolution of the 17th century began to challenge humoral theory and miasma. The discovery of microorganisms by Antony van Leeuwenhoek in 1676 proved that invisible creatures existed, though their role in disease wasn't understood for another 2 centuries. Real change came with the Industrial Revolution's new public health crises, which forced governments to act. In the 1850s, Dr. John Snow traced a cholera outbreak in London to a contaminated water pump, proving that disease spread through water, not air. His discovery led to the construction of modern sewer systems. Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch established germ theory in the 1860s and 1870s, finally explaining how disease actually spread. Suddenly, cleanliness wasn't just a preference, it was a medical necessity backed by scientific proof. Cities began building proper sewage systems. Indoor plumbing became common. Soap became affordable. Public health campaigns promoted hand washing and bathing. Hospitals adopted antiseptic practices. The mortality rate from infectious disease began to drop dramatically. Life expectancy, which had barely changed since Roman times, started to climb. But the psychological impact lingered. The Black Death killed so many people so quickly that it fundamentally altered European society. Labor shortages ended feudalism. Survivors questioned religious authority when prayers failed to stop the plague. Art became obsessed with death and decay. The Dance of Death motif showed skeletons leading people from all walks of life to their graves, a reminder that death came for everyone regardless of status. Perhaps most tragically, medieval Europeans suffered and died from diseases that were entirely preventable. Plague could have been controlled by eliminating rats and improving sanitation. Typhus required only clean clothing and soap. Dysentery needed clean water. Parasites could be prevented with basic hygiene. The knowledge to prevent these deaths existed in scattered forms, but the systems to implement that knowledge and the scientific framework to understand why it mattered had been lost. Behind every historical narrative of medieval grandeur, the soaring cathedrals and suits of shining armor, the romantic tales of knights and ladies, there are individual human stories of suffering that we've sanitized away. The medieval peasant who died of dysentery after drinking contaminated water, her stomach cramping, her body dehydrating, her children watching helplessly. The craftsman who developed tuberculosis from working in a damp, unventilated workshop, coughing blood for months until his lungs finally gave out. The child who died of smallpox, her body covered in pustules, her parents unable to comfort her pain. The entire families wiped out by plague, their bodies dumped in mass graves without ceremony or even individual burial. These weren't statistics. They were people with hopes, fears, loves, and dreams, whose lives were cut short by something as simple and preventable as dirty water, unwashed hands, or waste in the streets. Medieval hygiene practices represent one of history's clearest object lessons. When societies lose knowledge, when religious dogma overrides practical wisdom, when urban planning fails to keep pace with population growth, The result is suffering on a massive scale. The medieval period lasted roughly 1,000 years, and for most of that time, people lived shorter, sicker lives than their Roman ancestors had centuries before. Progress isn't inevitable. Knowledge can be lost, and when it is, ordinary people pay the price with their health and their lives. What makes medieval hygiene practices so haunting isn't just the filth or the disease. It's the fact that people accepted it as normal, as unchangeable, as simply the way things were. They didn't know that emptying chamber pots into the street created breeding grounds for disease. They didn't understand that their rejection of bathing made them vulnerable to parasites. They couldn't see the bacteria in their water or the fleas carrying plague. They were doing their best to survive in a world they didn't fully understand, using the medical knowledge available to them, which happened to be catastrophically wrong. Medieval Europe's descent into filth wasn't inevitable. It was the result of specific choices: to reject Roman sanitation practices, to let religious attitudes toward the body override practical health concerns, to build cities without planning for waste disposal, to trust in medical theories that had no basis in reality. And millions of people died because of those choices, their suffering forgotten or romanticized, reduced to historical footnotes about the Dark Ages, without any real acknowledgement of the grinding daily horror of living in constant filth and fear of disease. Perhaps most haunting of all, we know almost nothing about the vast majority of people who lived and died in these conditions. History preserves the names of kings and bishops, but not the woman who died of cholera in London in 1349, or the child who was eaten by parasites in Paris in 1456, or the family wiped out by typhus in Edinburgh in 1528. They lived, they suffered, they died, and history moved on, remembering the cathedrals they built, but not the diseases they endured, the art they created, but not the filth they lived in, the wars they fought, but not the daily battle for survival against enemies too small to see. The medieval hygiene crisis reminds us that civilization is fragile, that knowledge hard-won can be easily lost, and that the distance between comfort and catastrophe can be as small as the decision to wash your hands or dump your waste in the street. Even across the vast gulf of 7 centuries, their suffering speaks to us, warning us that we are never more than a few bad decisions away from their world, and that the cleanliness and health we take for granted are achievements built on the graves of millions who died because they lacked what we consider basic: clean water, soap, and the simple understanding that waste and disease are connected.